Good morning and welcome. We are so delighted that you are here. My name is Sarah Menard, and as president of the Foundation for Restoration of St. Genevieve, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this history conference. I think by all counts, this is the largest crowd you've ever had, and that's very encouraging. As you can imagine, events like this don't take place by accident, so I have lots of thanks to spread around, but especially to Bob Mueller. You will agree, I'm sure, that he has put together, single-handedly, a great program for today, and we have some fine speakers, and I know that you're going to just enjoy the day. I also owe special thanks to board member and my good buddy, Janet Leonard, who is the hospitality chairwoman of this event, and so if you were at the reception last night, you saw the work of her hands and this morning, so thank you very much, Janet. I want to thank all of the board members and the foundation secretary, Jack Ketting. He was the runner for all this and picked up all the food that you get to eat this morning, and he took care of all the folders and all the paperwork and all the emails and all the registration. Thank you, Jack. And I want to say thank you, and I don't know that they are here, but Frank and Annette Rolfe, who are so gracious as to open their house for tomorrow's tour. So thank you to them also. And I want to say a special welcome back to our first speaker, and that is Mr. Gary Edwards. He is well known to the St. Genevieve community. He was here and served as our city administrator from 1995 to the year 2000. And so during that long career, he has served as a news director for radio and television. He was chief of staff for a U.S. representative and chief of staff for Missouri Lieutenant Governor. He was the city administrator in Jefferson County, New Mexico, and most recently in Sedalia, Missouri. Gary's wife, Kathy, welcome, is a 25-year radio personality, and two years ago she created her own studio. And she makes commercials, does voiceovers, and is a narrator for various enterprising, including, and you have heard this, I know, USA Today's audio channel. She is also an accomplished musician and a composer. So together, they have created 3 historical documentaries, including The Edge of Radical, Truman and Sedalia, Wickenburg, Arizona, a Centennial, and their latest documentary, and that's the basis for today's presentation, which is Researching John Scott, Missouri's first U.S. representative. So welcome, Gary Edwards and Kathy.
Thank you so very much. Kathy and I are very glad to be back here in St. Genevieve. We spent many happy years here with our brand new son, at that time brand new son, to give you an idea how long it's been. He's getting ready to go into the Air Force after college now. So it's been a while since we've been here. We love this community. It's a wonderful community, and I brag about it wherever I am in the country, about the wonders of St. Genevieve. As was indicated, we like producing documentaries, local history documentaries, and we have produced several. And what we do with those is we make them available to, in the case of Arizona, for example, we make them available to either the chamber or the visitor center and donate it, and after we put all the work into it so that they can collect any funds that are received from the sale of the documentary. We've done that for each documentary. It's kind of a contribution to the community in a way. I was very familiar with John Scott through my work as chief of staff on Capitol Hill in Washington. Worked for 3 different congressmen. However, I left the federal and state government, and I entered city management. My first job out of graduate school was right here in St. Genevieve. Kathy and I came with our newborn son.
A little closer to the mic.
Very good, thank you. With our newborn son, Nathan, and he was a few weeks old, not exaggerating. He was just barely born when we moved to St. Genevieve. Most of my time was spent helping to oversee the flood recovery work of 93 and 95. Had two back-to-back 500-year floods, not telling you anything you don't know. But those were interesting days from 95 to 2000, to say the least. Also helping to build with the community and the Board of Aldermen and mayor and all the staff members helping to build the levee out there, the 50-foot high, mile-long levee. And this facility. During that period, we built the community center and the pool and the walk-around track and all of that. All of that occurred during a 5-year period. It involved a lot of people, many of you here in the community. Much of my free time while here was spent looking into the history of this wonderful city. One day I was walking through the old cemetery when I noticed John Scott's tombstone. I knew a little about him from my days in Congress. He was Missouri's first congressman, so a person working for a Missouri congressman would have heard about John Scott. So I knew a little, but not very much. And when I was walking around looking and saw that cemetery, that was the beginning of a 20-year research period. Wherever I moved, I continued the research of John Scott. He became my buddy after a while. I've come to the conclusion that he is probably, if not the most, one of the most unrecognized and underrated figures in Missouri history. And John Scott's life was a collection of firsts. You may have heard this, but the collection of firsts is extensive. He was Missouri's first U.S. congressman. He was on the board of trustees for Missouri's first Academy of Higher Learning located here in St. Genevieve. Served on the first territorial legislature. He was a prominent member of Missouri's first constitutional convention. Was the Missouri Territory's first U.S. attorney. And was on the first line in the Missouri struggle for statehood. We'll spend a little bit of time on that. He was very prominent in that struggle on the national scene as well as statewide. He was a father. Not many people realize this. I didn't realize it even with all my research. Father of Missouri education, according to a prominent Missouri historian, Floyd Shoemaker, the father of Missouri education. That's quite a title to be given by a reputable historian. Information about the period prior to his birth was found in, of all places, the Arkansas Historical Society. That's where I found a lot of that early material about John Scott. I'm talking about prior to his birth. Who were his parents? Who were his grandparents? You really need to get into that type of thing to get a good feel for who the person is. And the Arkansas Historical Society was a great place, in addition to the courthouse here, but that was after he moved here. That's where the courthouse here became a very played a very important role. Andrew Sr., John's father, came from Scotland as a young child. He came to the U.S. from Scotland with his father and mother, John's grandparents. However, the grandparents died on the boat trip after the boat trip over, leaving Andrew Sr., John Scott's father, leaving him an orphan. He was raised in a New York City orphanage. And as a young adult, Andrew Sr. learned the weaver trade as an indentured servant. And John Scott was one of 6 children born to Andrew Sr. and his wife, Elizabeth. The Vincennes period, very important in his early life. Kathy and I went to Vincennes a couple times and looked at the libraries there, researched the libraries there, and then talked with a number of people who might be familiar with that period. But that was an important period in his life. It's where John Scott began his professional legal life. He was an attorney. From Vincennes, Scott left for the College of New Jersey, later known as Princeton. There is no evidence, and all the history books say he either graduated from Princeton, or they certainly imply he graduated from Princeton. There's no evidence of that. And that's from Princeton University. There was a John Scott who attended at this time. I'm sure it was him. But there's no evidence of a John Scott graduating from the College of New Jersey or Princeton. Didn't have to graduate in those days. Just attending it was a significant accomplishment. After Princeton, after returning, he may have studied law. It's not certain, but he may have studied law under John Rice Jones. That would make sense. He was the Attorney General for the territorial governor at the time for that territory, William Henry Harrison. And John Rice Jones would become a Missouri founder, as we all know, and one of the state's great legal minds, and an important person in John Scott's professional and personal life. He eventually would marry a daughter of John Rice Jones. His brother, Andrew Jr., we'll talk about him, married a daughter of John Rice Jones, and lived here in St. Genevieve. Shortly after being sworn in as an attorney, John Scott was part of the entourage in October of 1804 to travel from Vincennes to St. Louis. Leading the large group was William Henry Harrison and the territorial judges who helped write laws in the area. They went over to St. Louis to present the laws that would be the first steps in leading towards statehood. And Scott was part of that entourage. Other attorneys were too that became leaders in Missouri. I didn't know Scott was until I started looking into the Indiana legal records and found out that his name in more than one source is listed as one of those in the entourage. William Foley, and a historian who you'll hear from, there'll be a clip from him later, he wrote this dictionary, encyclopedia of Missouri history, which many of you I'm sure have seen. And Dr. Joe Tice Bloom, one of the contributors to that, point out that he made that trip over from Vincennes to St. Louis. Very important step as far as early statehood. Richard Day is one of the people we talked with in Vincennes, and the clip that we used in the video, and he was the curator of the Vincennes State Historic Site, and then kind of retired and became the assistant curator of that site. That's when we talked with him, is when he was the assistant curator of the site, and talked about what happened before they went over to St. Louis, what would have happened with William Henry Harrison and the judges in preparation for going to St. Louis.
Over in the governor's house.
Yeah, if you want to start that over again.
Hold on.
He called together the 3 territorial judges that had been appointed along with him by President Jefferson, and they wrote laws. On October 1st, 1804, they met somewhere in Vincennes, probably over in the governor's house, and adopted a code of 15 laws.
The clips you see in here are in the documentary that we produced, which I believe is over in the visitor center here. Early life in St. Genevieve. Scott married Catherine Cobb of Cape Girardeau in 1810, and after about a year, they had a daughter, Elizabeth. Scott's mother and father, Andrew Sr. and Elizabeth, had moved to St. Genevieve by this time from Vincennes, and John's brother, Andrew Jr., also lived in St. Genevieve. Mr. Mueller, Robert Mueller, was very helpful to us in giving us a flavor in the documentary of what St. Genevieve was like. We used several clips in the documentary. Here's one about the early flavor.
Around 1800, it was predominantly French. They were French Canadians that had come down the Illinois and the Mississippi and settled across the river in Kaskaskia and Fort Deschartres and St. Philippe, St. Anne.
And sometime around 1812, 1813, John and Catherine, and this is going to be somewhat of a controversial issue, bought land on which MacArthur House now stands. It's a fact, they bought that land. But the question is, was the house there at that time? And I find that a fascinating question. It's probably not known. I hope it can be found out someday if that house was there. They bought the land, but did they live in that house? That's the house, as you know, when I was here, the old cars were around it, and now it's a beautiful structure there. He bought the land, and I like to think the house was there, and that he actually lived in that house. But I cannot prove that, and that has not been proven, at least to this point. And on those early days, Scott was on the first board of trustees for Missouri's first Academy of Higher Learning, located here in St. Genevieve. Not a small position to hold. Very significant in those early days with the Academy. And the Academy, as you well know, known all over the state, all over the nation for its importance in Missouri history. He served as a municipal trustee in 1812 and was reelected in 1815. That's the same as Board of Aldermen, City Council. He served in that position in 1812, was reelected in 1815. And during this period, John Scott became Missouri's first U.S. attorney, as was pointed out to us, and many people already know that, confirmed by the U.S. Department of Justice, that he was the first for Missouri U.S. attorney. The War of 1812 in Missouri, John Scott did play a role in that. He served as captain for several months, as is indicated by the National Archives, records for the National Archives. He probably, not known, but he probably led patrols along the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. He served under Henry Dodge, also of St. Genevieve. There's this picture that in the Capitol, this lunette in the Capitol, that has a picture of Henry Dodge in the War of 1812, and Scott was a part of that, but only for about 3 months or so. In those days, as I understand it, they served very short terms in the War of 1812. He served about 3 months and then got out and did other things. The election of 1816. When I was in Congress, elections fascinated me. Congressional elections fascinated me. I've been able to manage several national had national profile elections. So this attracted my attention, the election of 1816. It can be argued that it was the most violent in the history, in Missouri's political history. Scott decided to run for territorial delegate to the U.S. Congress by challenging incumbent Rufus Easton. This is for delegate to the territory. Easton had the powerful Missouri Gazette supporting him. Rufus Easton did. Not a small issue. Scott had no strong newspaper support. Not a small issue. Both Scott and Easton came to Missouri from Vincennes. Easton was also a part of that entourage, coming from Vincennes over to St. Louis. Both were attorneys. It's interesting. We talk about the media nowadays and how one-sided they are for this issue or that issue. We're kind of going back to the way it used to be, because newspapers back then would take sides with a particular candidate, and to say they were biased for that candidate is probably an understatement. And that happened in the election of 1816. Scott began preparing for the 1816 election in 1815, according to the records I ran across. And that's significant. That's a long period of time in those days to be campaigning or preparing to campaign. 1815 was the year Scott's wife, Catherine, died. So they were married about 5 years. It's possible, and this is based on census records, and there's some assumptions on my part on this. It's possible she died giving birth to twins, John T. and Catherine. They show up later with the age that coincides with her death, so that's possible. Scott won the election. If you have a chance to see the documentary, we go into a fair amount of detail in the documentary about that election and all that occurred and the violence that occurred in that election. He won the election, but only after some questionable tactics, and he barely won. If it weren't for Governor Clark declaring him the winner. He was a friend to Governor Clark. Then an argument could be made that he may not have won that election. Coach Sanderson's on the Missouri River played a very prominent role in all of this. Because some questionable ballots came from Coach Sanderson, brought to St. Louis to Clark. Clark said, okay, he's the winner, even though he was behind at that time. And Clark said, declared him the winner, so he went to Washington. Following behind was Rufus Easton. He was going to contest that election. And I want to stay with Kathy, make sure she's following me closely, because I'm wandering here a little bit. Boarding house, the contested election of 1816. Boarding houses in Washington, I spent some time on this, are quite significant. They were more than just places to sleep and eat. They were places where policy was made, friendships were made, there were social centers. We went to Washington, Kathy and I, as part of this documentary, and interviewed Matthew Wasinski. He's the historian for the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was well aware of Scott. And he talked about Scott's life in boarding houses there. In fact, it was more of a hotel in the case of Scott. He took kind of an elitist position and stayed in a hotel.
Scott would have been something of an outlier because he wasn't living necessarily in a boarding house. He lived in one of Washington's biggest hotels at that point. Originally Davis's Hotel, it changed ownership and names during his career in Washington to Brown's Hotel. But he was living with a group of anywhere from a dozen to maybe 20 members of Congress, some representatives, some senators. Thomas Hart Benton for a while lived in Brown's. And also some speakers of the House, Philip Barber and Andrew Stevenson, both of Virginia. So he was with some fairly upper crust individuals from Congress.
And Brown's Hotel had a couple of names, called different things during the time that Scott was in the hotel. But he stayed there his entire congressional career, which is very unusual. Usually they go from session to session and they'll change hotels. He stayed in what eventually became Brown's for his entire career. On December 19th, 1816, Easton, he followed Scott to Washington. He contested the election. The House Committee of Elections agreed with Rufus Easton that Scott's election was a fraud. So here we have Scott in Washington sitting on the House floor. We have Rufus knocking on the door symbolically saying, I want in, and the Committee of Elections agreed with Rufus Easton. There was something going wrong. Something went wrong in that election, and Scott did not deserve to have that seat. But that was a committee. That was not the full House. That's what was required to make a final decision. So Scott needed to convince the House to call a new election. Since he was losing the battle of I should keep this seat, he was losing that battle. If he could convince the Congress to call a new election, that would at least give him a shot at winning this seat. And it would be a win for Scott if a new election would be called. Dr. William Foley, many of you have heard of Dr. Foley, very prominent here in Missouri as far as a historian and author. He confirmed in our interview with him that, that was Scott's goal to call a new election because he was losing this other battle as far as the nitty-gritty details of the election. And Dr. Foley had some thoughts on that.
A lot of the members of the House said, we don't want to get involved in this, and it's not very clear, and there are competing stories and so on. So in the end, Scott's point of view was able to prevail to the extent that they just tossed out the election and said, well, we need another one.
So they did. They threw out the election. And Scott and Easton returned to Missouri to campaign again. By the way, it's kind of a side note. The reason they threw out the election is that Congress said, we shouldn't be involved in these regional, statewide conflicts, so Congress shouldn't be making these decisions, so we're going to throw it out. But they threw it out. That saved Scott. But this time, well, they both came back to Missouri, Easton and Scott, but this time things were different. In order to counteract the Gazette's support of Easton, Scott now had newspaper support from the Western Immigrant. That's what it was first called. And its editor, Thomas Hart Benton, the Thomas Hart Benton. And Thomas Hart Benton, a strong Scott supporter. So now he had newspaper support. This time, Scott handily won the election, sending him to Congress to represent the Missouri Territory. The election of 1816, 1817, one of the most deadly, if not an argument could be made, I believe, maybe the most deadly in Missouri history. Deaths occurred, duels occurred. Scott was almost involved in a duel himself when someone challenged him on some issue. And there was a newspaper battle saying a duel was going to come up as between Scott and someone else. And Thomas Hart Benton killed somebody as a result of this particular election in a duel. Statehood and the Missouri Compromise debate. Scott's role with the Missouri Compromise was significant. He didn't become a national figure during this debate, but Dr. Jo Tice Bloom, referred to her earlier, is of the opinion that Missouri would not have become a state as soon as it did if it were not for John Scott. We sent a camera crew to New Mexico to record her and her comments on John Scott. And she is probably the nation's leading expert on the delegate system, which is what we're talking about here with John Scott, and has written a number of papers on it. She and Dr. Foley know each other. They work together in different projects. But she had some strong opinions on John Scott. And one is Missouri would not have been a state as quickly as it became a state if it were not for John Scott.
Without him, statehood might not have come as soon as it did. He was able to talk to people, to make the compromises and wording and intent. I think was really one of the people most responsible for statehood for Missouri.
And again, that's another interview that is in the documentary. And there are several cuts by her in the documentary. If you have a chance to see it. So Scott represented Missouri opinion during this debate. Sometimes that meant being pro-slavery, sometimes not pro-slavery. It usually meant that many Missourians felt that slavery issues should not be intertwined with the issue of Missouri statehood. And that is the crux of the issue right there that Scott was so upset about, and the people in Missouri at that time. Don't mix the slavery issue with our attempts to become a state. It did, and a fair amount of time in the documentary spent on different elements of that. And Scott reflected that opinion. And Dr. David Heidler, well-known, world-renowned author, he specialized in this period. One of the books they looked at most closely with him on this particular documentary was the one about Clay. He's probably the world's leading expert on Henry Clay. He granted an interview at the Sidney Camera crew to Colorado Springs, where he is, and he points out that Scott did not like the idea of intermingling slavery with Missouri statehood.
Scott was also vehement in his objections early on to the efforts to place stipulations and conditions on Missouri's entrance into the Union, something that he rightly claimed was unprecedented because other states had been able to enter the Union without any sort of stipulations.
Henry Clay was a major, as we all know, Henry Clay was a major player in the Missouri Compromise debate. Clay and Scott already knew each other. Plus, Clay had, not many people realize this, but Clay had a half-brother here in Missouri. Nathaniel Watkins, he was from Southeast Missouri. He was an attorney down in Southeast Missouri like Scott. They probably rode the circuit together, don't know, but there's pretty good chance they did, since they're both attorneys, both in Southeast Missouri, and Watkins became, the half-brother to Clay, became Speaker of the Missouri House. And because of that relationship and other ties too, and there's one interview that's not used in here, and that's with we went to Ashland in Lexington, Kentucky, Clay's home, to interview the historian who's very familiar with that issue of Clay, and he pointed out that Scott also acted as an attorney for Clay outside of the roles in Congress to buy land for him, and there's some written documentation of that. As I said, he was a major player in the Missouri Compromise debate, and Clay was an important part of that. And at the end of the Missouri Compromise debate, an enabling act was approved, and Missouri could now write a constitution. That was the next step in this process: get the enabling act, and then Missouri can write a constitution, and then bring the constitution back, and Congress will decide if you'll become a state. I'm oversimplifying, but that's generally the approach that is taken. Writing a state constitution. Scott was a very active member of the Constitutional Convention. Historian Shoemaker called Scott the father, as we said earlier, of Missouri education because of his education contributions during the convention. Not many people realize that, and I think that's quite significant. Scott returns to Washington with the Constitution. They write it, and we spent a fair amount of time in some of the details as far as that Constitutional Convention. They wrote the convention. Scott picks it up and takes it back to Washington. But that Constitution carries some very controversial language related to slavery. And consequently, the second Missouri Compromise debate that occurred, largely because of that language that was in there. But they made it through that with Clay's help. Clay very instrumental in that. And Scott, during this whole national process, made some important speeches from the floor. Interestingly, Clay was very emotional in his speaking in the research work we did. Didn't need notes many times. He just spoke off the cuff. Clay, like a college professor, he had meticulous notes and followed them very closely. Consequently, there's very good records of the speeches he made. Missouri became a state after that second Missouri Compromise in 1821. Remaining days in Congress. The 1820 election, he was unopposed. And the 1822 election, he easily won. He was a hero in Missouri. An argument could be made that he was the most popular person, and the political person at least, in the state of Missouri. John Scott, your John Scott, St. Genevieve John Scott. That's 1822. 1824 began to change. The election was relatively close. He could have lost if there had not been a strong third candidate running for Missouri's single House seat. Remember, I'm losing track, we continue to lose congressional seats in Missouri. We're down to 7 or 8, whatever it is. But there was just one back then, one congressional seat. So like a senator, they represented the entire state. So in this election, 1824, he barely won the seat for the congressional, for the House that represented the entire state. Reason Scott began to lose support the longer he stayed in Congress. He didn't broaden his base. We spent a fair amount of time pointing out that he had strong support from the French population in St. Louis, very strong support. He didn't broaden much beyond that, and there are reasons for that. Not enough time to campaign across the growing district or the state. Travel was a big issue, of course. When Thomas Hart Benton, and this is important, when Thomas Hart Benton became one of Missouri's senators, first senators, Scott lost the strong newspaper support he had depended upon. He had newspaper support, but not as passionate, not as enthusiastic as Thomas Hart Benton gave him. In those days, congressional turnover was naturally high, so it was not that unusual for them to go out after a certain period of time. Nowadays, they stay in there for 500 years, something like that, and very little turnover, and because of all the tools they have at their disposal. But those are some of the reasons he began to lose his support. Scott remarried in 1824. Good records in your courthouse on this marriage, on papers that were made that day. Married in St. Genevieve, remarried in 1824 to Harriet Brady, the beautiful widow of Tom Brady of St. Louis, and the daughter of John Rice Jones. His brother Andrew married a daughter of John Rice Jones. He married, on the second marriage, a daughter of John Rice Jones, one of Missouri's founders. And Harriet brought several children to the marriage. I'll take just a second here to point out, and this is not proven, but I wondered about this. And I haven't looked into it extensively, so maybe there is some records there to point this out. Brady, her name was Brady. There was a Brady that carried those controversial ballots from Port Sanderson on the Missouri River to St. Charles to Governor Clark that helped Clark win that election. Was it the same Brady? After Mr. Brady died, did Harriet then marry John Scott? It's possible. I don't know. I've not researched that, but that's a fascinating question also. The presidential election of 1824. This is a huge issue, very fascinating, and I suppose you can make an argument that if John Scott didn't take the position he did and didn't do what he did in this election, which we'll talk about, then the person who won would have won. You can make that argument. It's not a strong case, but you'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. 16 candidates for president in 1824, but the most prominent were Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford. Missouri's preference clearly was Clay. He was a Westerner. He was the person who helped Missouri gain statehood. He was loved in Missouri. On election day, Clay won in Missouri. Not nationally, but Clay won in Missouri, with Jackson second, Adams third. Outstate, Missouri leaned toward Jackson. Outstate, Missouri leaned toward Jackson. And the St. Louis area leaned toward Adams. So the St. Louis area leaned toward Adams, outstate toward Jackson. Important division to keep in mind. Nationally, Jackson won. But no candidate got, in 1824, got enough electoral votes, so the election had to go to the U.S. House. Sound familiar? 3 candidates qualified for the House vote. Jackson, Adams, Crawford. Clay didn't qualify. It was in this environment that John Scott arrived in Washington in the fall of 1824 after his marriage. As Missouri's only House representative, he would cast Missouri's only vote for president. Carried a lot of power, as all the states just had one vote. So for the next 2 months, Scott would be making up his mind about who to vote for. Benton wanted him to vote for Jackson. Henry Clay and Missouri's other senator, David Barton, wanted Scott to vote for Adams. Even though he requested it, and he did request it, there's documentation on this, Scott got no direction from the Missouri legislature. I went through the minutes of those meetings where they debated, should we give him direction on who to vote for in this, and they decided to stay out of it. So Scott was right about that. On January 21st, 1825, a meeting was held between Scott and Adams at the Adams home. Adams was clearly trying to measure how many votes he had. During the meeting, Scott raised the issue of his brother, Andrew Jr. You could do a book on Andrew Jr., a fascinating character. He was an Arkansas territorial judge. He just killed another territorial judge in a duel. And he was facing impeachment because of that. So it's been alleged that Scott tried to sell his vote to Adams in exchange for not impeaching his brother Andrew if Adams got the election. National authors have remedied, I believe his name is has brought that issue up, who's done books on Jackson. He doesn't like Scott at all. Again, that's been alleged that selling of the vote occurred. No proof to it. This has been an unanswered question in U.S. and Missouri history. Did Scott sell his vote? We sent a camera crew to England, to Oxford, and there is a professor there, Dr. Donald Radcliffe, who had just written a book on the election of 1824, just right at the time that we were researching it, so it worked out nicely. We called him, took a while to get through to him, and said, can we send a crew there and interview you? And he said, yeah. He said, yes, much to our amazement. You know, we asked him a number of questions. One of the questions was, can it be assumed, can people get the impression that Scott sold his vote in exchange for, if he became a president, he would not impeach his brother? This was his reaction.
You could certainly make an argument to that effect. The letter inviting President Monroe to sack John Scott's brother had been on the president's desk for several months. He had taken no action, and he didn't expect him to take any action at this stage. Now, is there in that statement an implied hint that if Adams becomes president, he won't take any action either? You could certainly read it as such.
4 days before the House vote, Scott told, and after that meeting at Adams' house, 4 days before the House vote, Scott told Thomas Hart Benton he decided to go for Adams. Benton was furious, and those of you who have researched Benton know that that's a tempest, or that's a huge storm. Benton was capable of, he had a huge temper is what I'm trying to say. He was furious. And the friendship between Benton and Scott at that point terminated. And they were close. They were very close. And Scott depended on Benton, and Benton depended on Scott for many things with his position there in Washington prior to him becoming a senator. And but he was furious. Years later, if you read quotes from Scott, years later, 1850s, 1840s, he's still angry at Benton. I haven't read any quotes from Benton on Scott, but I know that Scott did not like Benton after that vote. So the friendship between Benton and Scott permanently severed. I'm gonna check my time here. Just about finished. Election day, February 9th, 1825. At noon, the Senate came into the House chamber to count the electoral votes. The outcome on that was known, of course. There were not enough electoral votes. That was already known, and so it was now up to the House to elect a president. Each state had one vote for a total of 24. It took 13 votes to be elected president. Crawford got 4, Jackson 7, John Quincy Adams 13. He won. 4 reasons were given by Scott for his vote for Adams, and these have been published in various newspapers at the time. He had no direction from the state. He was correct on that. He didn't. Missouri had stronger economic ties to the north than the south. Probably true. Jackson was less qualified. That's Scott's opinion. Scott was reluctant to support a military person. Again, that's Scott's opinion. Here's Dr. Foley again. Setting this up. There's something else that I didn't realize that came from the 1824 election that Scott is at least partially responsible for. It involves political parties, and Foley pointed this out in one of the many questions we asked.
Actually, Scott was instrumental in the creation of organized political parties, but that came when he cast the vote for John Quincy Adams, and that's when political parties as they existed nationally really began to take shape, and that influenced the developments in Missouri.
So, the man who was at one time the most the most popular figure, political figure in the state, was now the most scorned. You read newspaper articles at the time, and he was under a lot of criticism, just the antithesis of what had been the case just a few years before. Scott's 1826 election was going to be a tough one. That's a shot of him heading back. We have the documentary, back to Washington, raiding, he's forlorn and everything. But he's under a lot of pressure, and people are very critical of him back in Missouri for his vote for John Quincy Adams. The last campaign, several candidates were lining up to run against the vulnerable Scott. The most significant opponent was Edward Bates, who later became a member of the Lincoln cabinet. Bates won with 62% of the vote, and Scott lost, obviously. And it was all because of the 1820 vote. Scott returned to Congress one last time to campaign to complete the session. And for those few months, Congress did him a favor. They named him chairman of the Committee on Lands, a very important committee at the time. The end. In the winter of 1861, Scott was still making that horseback trip from St. Louis to St. Genevieve, back and forth. And that particular trip, the winter of 1861, would be his last. He got a cold from that trip. 78-year-old John Scott would become ill because of this bad weather. So from his sick bed, Scott gave one last interview to a reporter with the St. Genevieve Plain Dealer, and about his earlier life in Congress and all the battles, all the struggles, all the victories, etc. And an abbreviated version of that interview from his deathbed, which actually happened, is in that newspaper article. Scott died on June 9th, 1861. At the time, the nation was preparing for civil war, and it was a war that Scott opposed. Yes, he had to take a pro-slavery position in what he, during the Missouri Compromise debate, but he strongly supported the Union. He was a Union man, did not want to see the nation break up. So when he died, the nation was going the direction he did not want to see it, go to. I have to say that the people we interviewed for this, everyone, they were wonderful. And they know Scott. They worked with him also, meaning researched him. And they gave us information that we did not, we weren't aware of in many cases. And some of the biggest names in the nation and the world, as far as authors and researchers go, agreed to be interviewed for this. So if you have a chance to see the documentary, if you should, in my opinion, we don't get any money from it. It's being donated elsewhere. It tells a lot about what I believe about a person I believe is the most underrated and one of the most important people in the history of the state of Missouri. Thank you very much.